Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you with us today because we're going to unpack a truly fascinating shift that's happening right now in addiction science. For a really long time, the primary focus of the medical community was simply on diagnosing a condition. But as the science has matured, researchers are realizing that just identifying a disorder doesn't really tell us enough. Instead, the frontier of modern research is shifting toward understanding the unique shape, timeline, and trajectory of a person's recovery. Today, we're looking at a comprehensive academic review that asks a profoundly important question about exactly how we heal. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start by looking at the recovery mystery, then check out 5 lines of evidence. After that, we'll explore 2 scientific explanations, pause for some crucial clarifications, and finally wrap the whole thing up with why this matters. So part 1, the recovery mystery and the paths of healing. We're going to start with a widely observed phenomenon, which is that no 2 people recover from substance use struggles in exactly the same way. And honestly, that brings us to the central scientific mystery of this whole explainer. Are these wildly different recovery paths just continuous variation? Meaning, are they just ordinary human differences spanning a really broad spectrum? Or do they represent distinct phenotypes? Now, when we say phenotype in this context, we mean, are there reproducible, clinically meaningful subgroups within that broader spectrum? Basically, we're asking if the differences we see are just random noise, individual quirks, or are there underlying recognizable patterns of recovery that we could actually learn to predict? Well, to answer that, we first need to look at how modern medicine actually diagnoses addiction today. The current diagnostic framework deliberately treats substance use disorder, or SUD, as a broad dimensional spectrum. It's measured by symptom count and severity, mild, moderate, or severe. It is absolutely not a single, fixed, binary condition where you just have it or you don't. The diagnosis is intentionally heterogeneous, and honestly, that's a feature, not a bug, of modern psychiatry. But here's the catch, right? Sharing a diagnosis doesn't mean sharing an experience. Modern research shows that recovery is actually way more common than society often assumes. But the timeline? Wow, it varies wildly. You have some individuals who stop their problematic use, recover rapidly, and literally never really struggle again. And then you have others who might go through treatment, relapse, and battle these persistent, recurring cycles for years, even when they are incredibly motivated to heal. So time matters, but the shape of that time is completely unique to the individual. Let's move to section 2, 5 lines of evidence and the convergence of science. Because if only one field of science was noticing this variation in recovery, we'd probably just chalk it up to a statistical fluke. But that is definitely not what's happening. This brilliantly illustrates a massive convergence. 4 entirely independent disciplines are pointing to the exact same mystery. First off, epidemiology looks at massive population surveys and finds that outcomes vary widely but predictably across thousands of people. Second, we have longitudinal studies that track individuals over decades, proving recovery isn't just a single switch you flip. It's a dynamic, winding path. Third, clinical observation from doctors and therapists consistently reports that some patients heal with ease while others struggle repeatedly, despite doing everything right. And fourth, modern neuroscience actually shows us that the physical brain changes associated with substance use heal at entirely different biological rates for different people. But wait, I told you there were 5 lines of evidence, right? Well, that brings us to our 5th line, history. It turns out, for over 200 years, long before we had MRI brain scans or computational modeling or massive public health data sets, medical history was actually already identifying this exact same phenomenon. Yeah, historically, we've known this for centuries. Think about it. Back in 1784, founding father Benjamin Rush was already describing differing patterns of habitual drunkenness. Then, in 1935, Alcoholics Anonymous was founded, and they accumulated massive amounts of practical, observational experience about differing vulnerabilities to relapse. By 1960, E.M. Jelinek was proposing actual typologies to classify these different courses of illness. And today, we have modern neuroscience. Now, obviously, we don't use their old terminology anymore. Actually, scratch that. A lot of those old concepts have been totally scientifically retired. But their core clinical observation, the idea that different people experience entirely different patterns of recovery, that remains remarkably consistent today. Okay, moving into section 3, 2 scientific explanations and making sense of the data. So how does modern science explain this massive pile of evidence? Well, there are currently 2 competing theoretical models trying to figure this all out. Now, what's really interesting here is contrasting these 2 competing scientific models. On the one hand, you have continuous variation. This argues that recovery difficulty is simply a multidimensional spectrum. Like everyone's path is the result of countless interacting variables: genetics, environment, trauma, resources, and there are no clean dividing lines, just one big, continuous gradient of difficulty. But on the other hand, the recovery phenotypes model suggests that within that broad spectrum, there are actually reproducible, clinically meaningful subgroups, specific combinations of traits that consistently show up together and could help us predict how a recovery will actually unfold. You probably didn't expect to learn about rainbows in an addiction science explainer, but it's literally the perfect analogy. A rainbow is a perfectly continuous spectrum of light, right? There are no hard borders. And yet we still find it incredibly useful to categorize distinct bands of that spectrum as red or blue. Or think of blood pressure. It's a continuous spectrum, but doctors still use categories like normal or high because it dictates the treatment you get. So recovery could very well be a continuous spectrum that still contains highly useful distinct patterns.
But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's hit Section 4, Crucial Clarifications, and what this research does not say. We really need to pause the narrative for a second and set up some very strict scientific guardrails, because discussions around addiction can so easily be misinterpreted.
So the absolutely crucial point here is making sure we understand what this academic review does not say. It does not say these phenotypes are a proven fact. They are just a hypothesis worth investigating. It emphatically does not say that anyone is permanently broken or somehow incapable of recovery. It definitely does not suggest we should drag out old, outdated terminologies and replace our current medical frameworks. And it doesn't say that biology or brain scans alone hold all the answers while ignoring social and environmental factors. No. The honest, objective position of this review is simply this: we don't know yet if these patterns are real in a clinical sense, but the evidence is so incredibly strong that we have a scientific obligation to look. And looking means clearing a really high evidentiary bar. If the medical community is ever going to accept recovery phenotypes, any proposed pattern has to meet 5 strict standards. 1, it must be reproducible across totally independent populations. 2, it needs longitudinal stability, meaning the pattern holds true over time. 3, predictive validity. It has to actually predict outcomes better than what we already have. 4, it needs explanatory value. And 5, practical clinical utility. It has to actually help patients. History is just littered with failed typologies, like cloningers and bobbers from decades past, which sounded great in theory but completely failed to be consistently reproduced. Science demands rigorous proof. Which brings us to our final section: why this matters and the future of treatment. Why go through all this trouble to figure out if we're dealing with continuous variation or specific phenotypes? What are the real-world stakes here? Well, the stakes are literally the future of how we support human healing. The next frontier of addiction science demands a major shift in focus. We have to move past only asking, does this person have a substance use disorder at a single point in time? Instead, researchers must study the whole shape of a person's recovery trajectory over the course of years. The trajectory itself must become the primary unit of investigation. Whether it's a smooth line or a series of cyclical loops, understanding that unique shape is the key. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If we can finally unlock these trajectories, if we can definitively determine whether they are continuous variations or recognizable phenotypes, how will that revolutionize individualized treatment? Just imagine a future where a diagnosis doesn't just toss you into a one-size-fits-all program, but instead matches you to the exact type of clinical, social, and biological support your specific trajectory requires. That is the incredible promise of this research. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this explainer today. Keep asking questions and keep learning.